Tonight, the Northern Territory is set to lose one of only 2 federal spots in the House of Representatives as the battle begins to save our seat. Also tonight, more than 10,000 people in Victoria's hotspots refuse a COVID test as the numbers keep rising. The woman accused of grooming underage girls for disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein charged in the US. And Victoria loses the AFL with all games moved interstate and local teams shipped up to Queensland. Good evening, Amy Culpitt with ABC News. Differing rates of population growth around the country will trigger an overhaul of where the federal parliament's 150 electorates are based for the next election. Victoria gains an electorate, rising to 39 seats. Western Australia will lose a seat, dropping from 16 to 15 electorates. And the Northern Territory will be stripped of one of its 2 federal seats in the House of Representatives. It's prompted furious agreement from both sides of politics that the NT seat must stay.
The Territory's stagnant population growth has prompted the decision. The Australian Electoral Commission has decided both WA and the NT must lose seats. For the NT, that means losing one of its 2 House of Representatives members.
We are a small population, but we're half the population of Tasmania. Tasmania has more than 4 times the representation that we do in a very small landmass that's pretty easy to navigate around.
Despite the shrinking population, local groups are arguing the extra seat is needed and that the vast area to cover means the Territory should receive greater representation than the Commission's quota system currently allows.
I personally think it's a disaster. I think Aboriginal people want to be represented in Parliament.
Labor, which currently holds both Solomon and Lingiari, wants the Federal Liberal Party to pass legislation to save the seat.
42% or thereabouts of the population of Lingiari are First Nations people. That means they have a significant voice through me into the federal parliament. If we go to one seat, that voice will be diluted significantly.
A private member's bill which Labor introduced to the Senate last month, which would guarantee 2 seats, has been supported by the Territory's Country Liberals senator and the Nationals. The federal government gave it a lukewarm response but allowed it to go to a parliamentary inquiry.
What I would hope is that the bill could pass, or if it doesn't, if there's some better way of ensuring that we maintain our representation, then of course I'm open to that as well.
Sam McMahon says senior government colleagues have given strong indications the seat will be saved.
They do want to see us maintain our representation.
It's an issue she's now staked her political reputation on. Jane Barden, ABC News.
Another day, another large rise in new coronavirus cases in Victoria. 66 new cases overnight, not as many as the previous day, but still dangerously high. As the battle to slow the outbreak down continues, there's concerns thousands of people inside the lockdown suburbs have refused to be tested. The highest number of infections remain in Melbourne's northern suburbs, but suburbs outside the hot zone have also been put on notice.
In a city divided, even those just outside the lockdown zone are on tenterhooks.
If they're a hotspot, I would just say we are as well. It doesn't say, I wouldn't think that there'd be any defining line between us.
The suburbs of Kensington and Flemington aren't under lockdown, but have been named as hotspots for active infections, leaving some worried the lockdown could be expanded. Inside the lockdown area, 10,000 people have refused to get tested.
People believe that coronavirus is a conspiracy or that it won't impact on them. So what I want to stress here is that coronavirus is a very contagious virus.
There are now 442 active cases in Victoria, with 23 people in hospital and 6 in intensive care.
We all desperately want this to be over, but we've got to get on top of this spike. We've got to get on top of these unacceptably high case numbers.
While some postcodes in the lockdown zone have just a handful of active cases, to the north of Melbourne, the 3047 postcode, which takes in Broadmeadows, has 25 cases. And in the 3064 postcode around Craigieburn, infections are still alarmingly high with 52 active cases. Only one new case today comes from hotel quarantine, and hotel operator Ridges has welcomed the investigation into misconduct by security staff supervising those in quarantine, saying it wasn't responsible for hiring those workers.
It's not DHHS, and that is why it's important that the judicial inquiry completes its work.
As numbers remain high, masks could become a more common sight on Melbourne public transport, with workers calling for them to be made mandatory.
We're calling on the travelling public to wear a mask when you catch a train or a tram, and the reason for that is because there may be social distancing issues.
As the reality of lockdown sinks in, there's targeted mental health support for people doing it tough.
People in those 10 postcodes are following the rules, are doing the right thing. From my government to you, from my family to yours, I say thank you. Thank you so very much.
Nicole Asher, ABC News, Melbourne.
Sydney residents queued for hours today to get tested after a Woolworths worker with coronavirus tested negative, then positive again. So what are the risks someone like that could be spreading the disease? National Science reporter Michael Slezak explains.
News that someone in your community has had a positive test result for coronavirus can be scary, but infectious disease experts say several studies help ease these concerns.
I think the probability is that that person was very likely to have very low levels of virus, and it was also very likely that it wasn't infectious.
One Korean study looked at 285 people who had coronavirus, then tested negative, but later tested positive again. They traced 790 contacts of those people and found 27 of them had the virus. But of those 27 people, 24 already had it, and 3 had other likely sources of infection.
But just to see if there was any chance that maybe they'd missed something, they said, can we take any of this sample and show that it's infectious by letting it multiply up in effectively a test tube with cell lines? And the answer again was no.
Another French study found that although positive test results could be seen for up to 20 days after infection, people didn't seem to be contagious for longer than 8 days. Because of studies like this, the World Health Organization advises that positive test results weeks after infection are not a sign the person is contagious. Virologist Sasha Stelzer-Braid agrees the virus in these people is probably inactive.
The PCR test that they use, it picks up really small parts of the viral genome, but it's unlikely after a long period of time and after symptoms have resolved that that virus is there in its entirety and that it's infectious.
Science providing some comfort in a worrying time. Michael Slezak, ABC News.
The Chief Minister says the government is working to make sure public messaging around coronavirus testing for people in isolation is made clear. It comes after confusion around just who is supposed to organise the tests.
Eased border restrictions came into effect in the NT 2 weeks ago, meaning interstate travellers and returning Territorians can choose where to quarantine. One of the requirements is COVID-19 tests on entry and exit, but that's not what happened for one Alice Springs resident who was flown to Adelaide for an operation and then flown back to the NT. He travelled on a medical flight but wasn't taken through the main terminal where authorities check interstate arrivals.
They just basically, when we got off the plane, we went inside and then the lady said, "Oh, how are you going to get home?" And I said, "Oh, my wife's going to pick me up," and that was basically it.
He says once he landed, he tried to go to the main terminal for COVID advice, but it was closed, so he went home and began his quarantine as required. The Chief Minister says it's up to individuals in quarantine to organise COVID tests themselves.
The requirement under the Chief Health Officer's direction is in that first 3 days you're meant to go and get tested, so the onus is on the individual.
At a press conference yesterday announcing the NT's first case in months, the Health Minister said tests also need to be done at one of the pandemic clinics across the NT.
People will be tested whilst they're in quarantine, but if anyone wants to be tested earlier because they have symptoms, then they should reach out.
The Chief Minister said following quarantine rules is the most important thing travellers can do.
That's the absolute gold plate standard about making sure that you're safe and you're safe for Territorians. This is the 14-day replication cycle. You stay inside during those 14 days, you do the right thing doing that, you will do the right thing by us.
He says anyone who's confused about the requirements should call the COVID-19 hotline. Mitchell Abram, ABC News.
Candidates in the Eden Monaro by-election have been making their final pitches to voters ahead of polling day tomorrow. Voters have been doing it tough, and all they want is certainty after bushfires and the economic downturn brought on by the coronavirus crisis. Here's Tom Lowry.
Mick Klima's ski shop in Cooma, about an hour from the New South Wales snowfields, should be bustling. This weekend is usually one of his biggest of the year.
I've never seen it this quiet. It's good in a way, but it's not good in other ways. There's not too much pressure on me, there's not much happening.
Between COVID-19, the economic crisis that comes with it, and poor snowfalls, things aren't looking great. But Mick still has 150 staff working day and night.
I think it's 20 staff that we can be on JobKeeper, which is a great help, you know. The government's done a bloody good job.
As voters head to the polls in Eden Monaro tomorrow, the coalition candidates want JobKeeper to be top of mind.
What I've heard from people is how important JobKeeper has been. It's meant that businesses have been able to keep staff on. It's meant they've been able to keep their doors open.
Certainly JobKeeper has been helpful for families to keep their mortgages going and so forth.
Labor's been hitting voters with a different line on the same message.
If you think the Liberals should keep their promise and not take JobKeeper away from struggling local businesses so soon, the by-election is your chance to tell them so.
They're not seeing a plan for what's going to happen after September. You know, snapping back after September is going to literally break the back of some of our small businesses.
Winning Eden Monaro isn't easy. It's held by Labor with a margin of less than 1%. In many ways, its population is quite similar to the rest of Australia. But there are some key differences, and they leave it particularly vulnerable to the health and economic impacts of the coronavirus. For one, it's slightly older than the rest of the country. Its median age is 43, and it's less well off, partly due to that older demographic. So the discussions around the handling of the virus will be sensitive to many. Jeremy Ma just bought a cafe in Cooma and understands it's an unusual time to take on a new business.
I guess you'd probably think so, but it's also probably worse to try to find a job. So I figured just buy myself a job.
He'll go into the polling booth tomorrow wondering who is best to lead the country through the rest of this year.
Top of my mind is, I guess, stimulus beyond the end of September.
For voters, certainty is the issue. Tomorrow's outcome is anything but. Tom Lowry, ABC News, Cooma.
A historic agreement has been signed by Aboriginal leaders and governments to establish national Indigenous justice targets. It comes as part of the revised Closing the Gap policy, which will set new aspirations around Indigenous health, employment and education. The plan will also establish additional national goals around housing, foster care and language preservation. It will be signed off by National Cabinet in the coming weeks when the targets will be released. Recovery workers are continuing to look for people missing after a landslide in northern Myanmar, which killed at least 162 mine workers. Several bodies were recovered from the site this morning as the operation entered a second day. Heavy rain hampered the search for bodies in a lake below the mine. Many of the victims are migrant workers who sift through waste products at the mine searching for jade. The industry is dominated by companies with links to the Myanmar military and Chinese businesses and has a poor safety record. The new Chinese national security laws imposed in Hong Kong this week have prompted many international students to consider ways of staying permanently in Australia. The federal government is considering offering special visas to Hong Kong nationals so they don't have to return. That's causing anger in China, but for students here, it could be a lifeline.
Tom planned to return home to Hong Kong to work once he finishes his engineering degree in Sydney. But now he's too afraid to go back after national security laws were imposed on the city this week.
There's a lot of people there, including me, like to speak out against the government when we see something that we don't agree with. And as a result, so if I go back, I could very likely be arrested.
The 20-year-old will instead try to forge a career here in order to stay for as long as possible. However, there's no clear pathway to permanent residency.
I would like to see the Australian government lower the visa requirements for Hong Kong students so that a lot of them could come here and gain Australian citizenship easier.
Their relatives in Hong Kong, and just ask them if they can stay in Australia. Just try their best to stay in Australia and don't go back to Hong Kong, because now Hong Kong is not safe for them.
Australia has used safe haven programs to protect people fleeing war or persecution for decades. The federal government is now considering whether to do the same for Hong Kong nationals, either through a humanitarian or skilled migration visa program.
We're just working carefully through scenarios in terms of what could occur, what we may need to respond to, and they include scenarios around whether or not there may be individuals who need safe haven.
News that has further inflamed tensions with China.
We advise the Australian side to look at this law in the correct objective manner and stop using the Hong Kong issue to interfere in China's internal affairs, moving further down the wrong path.
So I think Australia needs to act swiftly to demonstrate that Australia is willing to support democracy movements around the world.
A decision will likely be made next week. Lydia Feng, ABC News, Sydney.
The former girlfriend of deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein has been charged in the United States over her alleged role in sex trafficking. Ghislaine Maxwell is accused of recruiting and grooming girls as young as 14 so they could be abused by the late Epstein. North America correspondent James Glenday reports.
Early on Thursday morning, the FBI moved in on a mansion in New Hampshire.
So how does it all look? Is my hair good? It's all
Their target was Ghislaine Maxwell, a 58-year-old accused of procuring girls for her former partner and convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein.
Maxwell played a critical role in helping Epstein to identify, befriend and groom minor victims for abuse.
Court documents say she did this by first taking the girls to the movies or shopping, before trying to normalise sexual abuse by discussing sexual topics or undressing in front of them. Most of the crimes she's charged with are alleged to have taken place in several of Epstein's luxurious homes between 1994 and 1997.
Like Epstein, Ms. Maxwell chose to blatantly disregard the law and her responsibility as an adult, using whatever means she had at her disposal to lure vulnerable youth into behaviour they should never have been exposed and which creates lasting harm.
The alleged victims have repeatedly demanded authorities pursue those who enabled Epstein's sex trafficking scheme.
We need to get to the bottom of everybody who was involved with that, starting with Ghislaine Maxwell.
And today, one woman, Jennifer Arose, released a statement saying Maxwell's arrest means some justice for survivors can exist.
Many of Epstein's alleged accusers had worried no one would be punished after the disgraced financier hanged himself in jail while awaiting trial. But after today's developments, there's hope the investigation could gather steam.
Ms. Maxwell, a British socialite, is said to have introduced the financier to powerful people, including Prince Andrew, who denies any involvement with the alleged victims. The Duke's team says they've reached out to the Department of Justice twice in the past month and received no reply.
I will say that we would welcome Prince Andrew coming in to talk with us. We would like to have the benefit of his statement.
As for Ms. Maxwell, she could end up spending time in the same jail where Epstein died, and if convicted, she may face more than 30 years behind bars. James Glenday, ABC News, Washington.
US President Donald Trump says he's now open to wearing a mask as his country sets a new record for the most cases recorded in a single day. Cases in the US surged by more than 55,000, bringing the total to more than 2.7 million and more than 130,000 deaths. The recent surge has led to a number of states reversing reopening plans ahead of 4th of July celebrations. The US President Donald Trump says authorities are revising health advice.
All of these people are working with governors and local officials to restore best practices, and that's what we've done. That includes face coverings, social distancing, testing, and personal hygiene. Wash your hands.
In South America, Brazilian authorities are also struggling to contain the pandemic, with the country's death toll exceeding 61,000. In India, infections have passed 600,000 after authorities introduced relaxed lockdown rules earlier this week. The Kimberley's King Leopold Ranges have been stripped of their colonial name. The ranges were originally named after the Belgian tyrant King Leopold II, who was responsible for mass atrocities in the Congo.
At a low-key ceremony in Derby, a large swathe of the Kimberley had its Aboriginal name restored.
I'm delighted to announce today that we will be renaming, as of now, the ranges to the Winaman Millawundi Ranges instead of the former King Leopold Ranges.
The Winaman Millawundi Ranges are east of Derby and north of Fitzroy Crossing. They're home to some of the Kimberley's most prized waterholes, the Bell and Leonard River Gorges, must-see spots for campers travelling the Gibb River Road, and the traditional lands of the Nyaranyan and Bunuba people.
It's very important that we are given that opportunity to have our cultural, customary names be recognised.
Explorer Alexander Forrest and his expedition team named the ranges after King Leopold in 1879. Statues of the Belgian tyrant, who some historians estimate killed millions of Congolese people, have been repeatedly vandalised by Black Lives Matter campaigners. But the WA government says it had been planning the ranges' name change for some time.
I'm very proud to be the minister who happens to be the minister when we got to rename this, but I do acknowledge that this has been broadly supported for a long period of time. It just happens that now is the right time to get this done.
The name change takes effect immediately. Eliza Borello, ABC News.
To finance now, local shares were supported by good economic news from the US and China, while consumers headed back to the stores as the lockdown eased. Here's Philip Lasker.
JobKeeper, JobSeeker and consumerism are proving their worth. As restrictions were lifted, retail sales jumped a record 17% in May after a record 18% slump in April. So desperate were Australians to spend that they shopped in department stores. In fact, the growth rate was above pre-COVID levels. Clothing sales more than doubled as the lifting of restrictions meant changing T-shirts. Eating out also picked up strongly, although they're still below pre-COVID levels. All states surged ahead, but more recent data from ANZ suggests the current flare-up in COVID infections in Victoria and the accompanying restrictions will see sales fall away more sharply than other states. And the other category that's doing it tougher is small business. The big end of town enjoyed a pickup due to panic buying as the lockdown struck, then a crash before this sharp recovery. Smaller players experienced a slump in sales and the current recovery isn't as strong. Sales growth for big business is above pre-COVID levels, but that's not the case for small business. Late buying pushed the local market to a positive close, ending another pretty good week. Telcos and healthcare stocks supported the market, but banks were weaker. The Australian dollar's firmer against most currencies, sitting comfortably above 69 US cents. And here's another government concession that's doing the trick. Commercial vehicle sales growth was falling in line with a slowing economy pre-COVID, but it's picked up for only the second time in 18 months thanks to the instant asset write-off. And that's finance.
AFL legend Nicky Winmar has spoken about his decision to sue former TV presenter Sam Newman, saying he is taking a stand for his people. Winmar has taken legal action against Newman after he suggested the former St Kilda player's iconic 1993 jumper lifting gesture was not about race. The pair met face-to-face today as they held mediation talks with their lawyers in Melbourne. Winmar said it's been an emotional few weeks.
So I am black and I'm proud, and I'd like to thank the rest of Australia for supporting this. It's very important, not only for me but for my people.
Photographer Wayne Ludby, who took the famous image, has also joined the legal action against Newman, Mike Sheehan and Don Scott. All 10 Victorian AFL teams will leave the state after this weekend and relocate to hubs in Queensland, New South Wales and Western Australia. The AFL has released the fixture for the next 2 rounds, with games to be played predominantly in New South Wales and Queensland. As Peter Lusted reports, the Victorian sides are expected to be interstate for a month.
It's enough to make a Victorian sick.
Queensland's going to be the home of the AFL. And, they should give us the grand final after this.
The increase of cases in Melbourne and the various state government restrictions on Victoria means its teams are hitting the road. All 10 sides will be out by Monday night headed for hubs interstate. St Kilda, North Melbourne, Essendon and the Bulldogs will head to Queensland alongside Richmond and Carlton. Hawthorn and Melbourne will be off to New South Wales, and Geelong and Collingwood to Western Australia after a week in Sydney.
We can't wait to go. I'm excited. I think it's going to be a blessing, really. We're strong in connection at our footy club, and this is going to give us an incredible opportunity to connect.
Victorian teams will be away for 32 days and play 4 or 5 games before returning. But with this ever-evolving situation, there's no guarantee that football will be back here in Victoria this season. Those players who need it will be able to travel with their families.
We'll definitely take all our players. We're hoping to be able to take partners and young children. But there might be one or two who may not be able to go, and that's fine.
The New South Wales and Queensland teams will only travel between those two states for the next few rounds, while for others, the hubs are over.
The South Australian WA-based clubs will return home after round 5 and round 6 respectively, with Port Adelaide returning to Queensland to play matches in rounds 6 and round 7.
The fixture is in place until at least the next change.
The team that wins this year's flag will be the team that accepts the change, embraces the challenge and shows the resilience to get on and just get it done.
Peter Lusted, ABC News, Melbourne.
The Melbourne Storm is celebrating a thrilling 27-25 Golden Point win over arch rival the Sydney Roosters in the NRL. This field goal from Luke Keary gave his side a 1-point lead with less than a minute to play. But with 10 seconds left, the Storm potted a field goal of their own to level the score and send the match into extra time.
It goes back to Pappenhausen! Pappenhausen strike! Pappenhausen! I don't believe it! This game is from another universe!
At the end of the day, if you keep trying, sometimes, good things happen. So, as I said, there was, it was a tough game tonight. Like, it was tough, it was physical, and, both sides, obviously had to play right to the end.
A penalty against Jake Friend in Golden Point sealed it for the Storm. Cameron Smith stepped up to convert the kick, which ended the defending Premier's 5-game winning streak. Now to the weather, and Joel Spry sent in tonight's viewer photo of Stokes Hill Wharf. A line of showers moved across the Arnhem District this morning and winds picked up across central Australia. In Darwin, temperatures dropped to 21 overnight, 33 the top today. Berry Springs and Bachelor both had tops of 34. Around the Territory, Alice Springs ranged between 4 and 19 degrees. Tennant Creek had a top of 27. Katherine, Borroloola and Wadair all had tops of 34. Around the country, Melbourne and Hobart both reached cold tops of 10. Sydney was 18 and Brisbane 25. A weak cloud band extends across the Pilbara, while cloud associated with this morning's showers can be seen extending across the top end. A strong high is moving into the Great Australian Bight as a series of cold fronts move through the southeast of the continent. Interstate tomorrow, more rain on the way for the southeast. Sunny in Brisbane, 21. Perth is expecting a top of 22 degrees. To our north, rain in Singapore, 34. 29 the top in Dili tomorrow. Denpasar heading for a high of 31. Around the Territory tomorrow, Alice Springs in for a cool day, 16, Yuendamu and Papunya both with tops of 18. Further north, Katherine, 31, Maningrida, 32, and blustery conditions in Numbulwar, 27 degrees. Temperatures dropping to 22 tonight in Darwin, 33 the top tomorrow, with similar conditions right around the top end. There's a strong wind warning in place tonight for the Arafura coast, and wind warnings will be in place tomorrow for the Beagle, North Tiwi, Arafura and Roper-Groot coasts. Low tide tomorrow morning will be at around 11:30, the high of more than 6 metres at around 5 o'clock. Sunrise will be at 8 minutes past 7 and set at 6:34. And looking ahead for Darwin, becoming drier and windier tomorrow as a new surge arrives in the top end. And in Alice Springs, cold nights and frost are expected to return early next week. And to stay up to date with the latest news from the Northern Territory, head to our website news.abc.net.au. And that's ABC News for this Friday night. Thanks for your company. Good night.